we believe that for the most part, nature has it right with products. And so if we
Yeah.
can get back to nature and look at the diets that our ancestors were eating, and try to get back to that simple, clean, and real approach that's sustained, humans and animals since the dawn of time. I think it'd be hard to really improve on an orange. And yeah, maybe you can, use some complex chemistry, and maybe they'll get close and eventually be able to make an egg, or maybe they could make a fig even better than nature can make it. But I tend to believe and want to live in a world where I think that nature has it right.
This is Evolve CPG's Brands for a Better World podcast, featuring purpose-driven leaders who not only believe in better, but actively pursue it. That's better products, better brands, and better leadership for a better world. Thanks to you, our listeners, this podcast is now ranked in the top 10% of all podcasts globally. Let's not stop there, though. You can help us reach more people by taking a moment to leave us a rating or review, which is critical for podcast algorithms, and by sharing your favorite episodes with your network. The more people we reach, the more good we can bring about in this world. If you work in the industry, you can also join our online community where we're going further, faster, together at community.evolvecpg.com. I'm your host, Gage Mitchell, founder and creative director of Modern Species, a sustainable brand design agency helping better brands grow and scale their impact. On this episode, we're speaking with Darryl Bosshardt with Redmond about his family's massive underground salt mine in Utah, how salt went from being essential for life to something we now avoid, 3 questions to ask yourself when shopping for food, and much more.
Hi, I'm Darryl Bosshardt. Delighted to be on the program today. A little bit about me. I grew up in a small town in central Utah, little town called Redmond. It's named after these 3 red mounds that are behind the town. And my grandfather and his brother had a farm in this little community back in the 1950s. And the farm wasn't doing that well. It was a drought year. And they knew there was salt located under their farm that the Native Americans had actually harvested long before the settlers came into the West. And so they knew about these outcroppings of salt north and south of their farm. When the farm wasn't doing that well, they needed something to do to keep feeding the families and to provide work. And in World War II, my grandfather worked for a company in California called McDonnell Douglas. It's a airplane manufacturing company. So he had some business experience there. His brother was a miner at the big copper mine here in Utah called Kennecott. So because of this business and mining experience they had when the farm wasn't doing that well, they got a loan and bulldozed the alfalfa and the corn and the barley out of the way and started to mine salt. And so that's how I got into the salt business. And I think salt is fascinating. It's one of the most misunderstood minerals on Earth. For thousands of years, it sustained life. It was a source of trade. It was written about in every religious text. And now people think salt is salt or salt is bad. And so I think salt's pretty cool. So hopefully we can talk a little bit more about that today.
Yeah, that's awesome. I'm excited for your excitement, and I'm excited to just learn more about it because I'd known of real salt before chatting with our mutual friend Dennis, and he just went on and on about how cool real salt was and some of the origin story. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. I need to learn more about this because I think everybody knows about general sea salt, but I don't think that many people know about things like salt mines. So I'm excited to dig deeper into that. And you already mentioned a little bit about how the mine came to be, which is fascinating. But to dig a little bit deeper in there, it sounded like your grandfather knew there was salt on the land, but did he have any idea how much salt was on the land, or was it just like, I think if we dig under there, we'll find something? But I mean, as far as I understand, it's a pretty big salt mine, right?
Yeah, at the time, he really didn't know. What's interesting is this piece of property was his grandfather's farm as well. So it had been in the family a long time. And so they knew there was salt there. And his grandpa told him, never go into the salt business because you'll lose your shirts. It's a terrible business. It's a commodity. Just don't ever go into the salt business. And geologists put this seabed as a 150 million year old deposit. If, of course, we weren't alive back then to confirm or deny the exact time frame,
Yeah.
but geologists say that the Arctic Ocean flooded down when the supercontinent Pangaea was still one solid continent, and it flooded, left this massive body of salt water covering what's now Utah, Colorado, parts of Montana, Idaho, massive inland sea called the Sundance Sea. And this seabed was then buried. Utah and the whole Great Basin that's been pushed up used to be down at sea level. And as Utah was compressed and pushed up, this seabed that was layers upon layers was pushed up into a dome. And this dome is about a quarter mile wide, 3 miles long, and about 5,000 feet deep. So he didn't have any idea the scope when they first started mining. Now geologists and our engineers say we have probably about 900 years left worth of mining in this location.
Wow. And you say in this location, but there are other locations that could also be mined in that general area, I assume?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The salt itself was pushed up right near the surface, within about 30 feet of the surface under my grandfather's farm, and just pretty much right dead center, right on top of this salt that was pushed up. So this same salt deposit, if you actually go all the way into New Mexico, this same deposit is there. It's just so deep, it's not economical to mine because it was only pushed up in this one location that serendipitously or by fate was underneath my grandfather's farm.
Wow, that's pretty cool twist of fate there to have the one part that's accessible. That's cool. But I guess if humanity in a pinch really needed more salt, they could dig down in New Mexico as well.
The interesting thing about salt, you mentioned sea salt at the top of the show.
Yeah.
And if we asked who has heard salt's bad for them, my guess is most of the audience would raise their hand. And if we asked who has heard that sea salt is better, I would guess, again, most people raise their hand. What's interesting is salt, in order of importance, is third on the list. We have oxygen, which is the most important thing to keep us alive. Then we have water, and then we have salt. And salt was always such an important part of humanity that every civilization started around access to the salt deposits because it was so needed for trade and the spice trades. Our animals needed salt. It was essential for food preservation. And because it was so important, Roman soldiers were actually paid salt as a wage. The term salary is based on salt and saline. And the term "is a man worth his salt" is because if you were paid a wage or a salary in salt and you weren't working hard to earn your keep, you weren't worth the salt that you were getting paid. And so there's a lot of these sayings that we have in our society today because salt was such an important part of all civilization. And yet now we hear salt's bad for us. So it's kind of funny how it came so far, and now people are realizing that salt isn't bad like they thought it was.
Well, I'm no medical expert. I could probably ask my medical siblings for if this is true or not. But my theory around salt and why it's been labeled as bad is that it's only been labeled as bad for people with like high blood pressure, because when the salt gets in your body, it absorbs water and thins out your blood or something like that, and has the blood in your circulatory system like be more volumeful because of all the liquid it soaked up, which puts pressure on your veins and arteries and stuff like that, which could cause some things to burst. With that said, beyond like high blood pressure, I don't know if I've seen that salt is bad for you in other ways, but of course, if you have anything in massive amounts, like everything should be consumed in moderation. I'm sure if you just like licked on salt for like a month straight, you'd have some problems, right? But for the most part, all these like avoid salt in your diet kind of trends, my assumption or my limited understanding is that it's mostly for people with high blood pressure. Is that correct? Is that your understanding as well?
Yes and no. So when you think about salt in the body, if we went to the hospital, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to give us an IV of saline solution, which is salt water. Even if you have high blood pressure, you will still get an IV of salt water, because an IV of anything but salt water, an IV of distilled water, an IV of coffee or tea, an IV of anything but 0.9% saline would actually be disastrous. It would kill us. Your cells would start to rupture. So unless you have kidney failure or you're on dialysis, our kidneys are designed and set up to process high amounts of salt. Now, what's interesting with salt is before the refrigerator, you and I would have both eaten more salt, because everything we would have eaten would have been, if it's outside of season, would have been preserved with salt, whether that's jerkies, whether that's preserved meats, kimchi, sauerkraut, fermented veggies, pickles. Salt was essential for all of those things. However, there's two challenges. If we went back to the turn of the century, salt was very different than it might be when you go to the grocery store today. And the foods that we're putting the salt on is also, for a lot of people, very different. And so it's not the salt that's the problem. As you point out, it's the ratio or the consumption. And then because salt is a great preservative, salt is used to preserve foods way longer than they should last. And so if somebody's eating out of, boxes and cans and a lot of processed non-organic foods, they're going to be getting high amounts of processed salt on their high amounts of processed foods, which is a terrible combination. When you switch over and you're eating more raw and organic and clean foods, you'll actually, just like our early ancestors, would have to go out of your way to find and consume good amounts of good, clean salt. But if you're eating on the road a lot, eating in restaurants, eating out of cans and boxes and frozen meals, you probably are getting more salt than your body needs because of the poor food choices that you're making to get there. And there was actually a study in 1950 that it's called Evidence for the Relationship Between Sodium Chloride Intake and Human Essential Hypertension. And this one study is what linked salt as problematic. And what they did is they fed these mice copious amounts of processed salt. And sure enough, the mice had some serious problems with high blood pressure and water retention, all kinds of problems. But it wasn't mice in nature eating food like they should with normal amounts of salt. And so just like fat went through this phase where all fat was determined to be bad for us, salt went through that same process where everybody thought salt was bad, just like everybody thought fat was bad. But fat itself, we know now, is essential. Good fats are, in fact, really good. Bad fats are really, really bad. And salt is the same way. Highly processed salt on very processed foods, absolutely a problem. Good, clean salt on good, clean, natural foods in the right amounts, absolutely essential for life.
Yeah. That's part of what blows my mind around health trends and diets and all the information that comes out on food pyramids and such. It feels like, I think everyone feels like health and nutrition is confusing because the target's always changing, right? Oh, eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you, salt or fat's good for you, salt's bad for you. And it's just all over the place and nobody can really keep track of it because the information keeps changing. But the way I see it is that if we just use some common sense and eat what it made sense for our ancestors to eat in terms of lots of plants, whole food, occasional meat in season or whatever, and not a lot of preservatives, not a lot of processed food, and everything in moderation, because you couldn't find enough stuff to not eat in moderation, right? I feel like as long as we stick to those core principles, then we're fine. But it's when we start breaking out every single nutrient as good or bad, or lumping things like all fats together when fats are different. And I would also argue that every body is different too. So genetically, some people need a little bit more protein in their diet than other people genetically, as far as I can tell. But it's when we try to break things down in isolation and say, this one thing is bad for you out of context of everything else that you're eating and how much you're sleeping and what your genetic background is. I feel like that's when it gets confusing, is when we try to generalize things like that.
You may not have noticed or known this, but you just quoted almost word for word an article from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition.
Oh,
And
nice.
this article was published by the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it was called "The Dietary Guideline for Sodium: Should We Shake It Up?" Yes. And
Uh,
what they find is that individuals could be in the highest or the lowest blood pressure groups, regardless of the amount of sodium they were consuming, as
yeah.
long as they had adequate amounts of calcium, potassium, and magnesium. And so the study, it says, thus, it is adequate consumption of all essential nutrients rather than the modification of any single nutrient that should be the focus of population-wide dietary recommendations for blood pressure reduction. And so you hit it right on the head that rather than focusing on any single nutrient, by going back and looking at that holistic version of diets that our ancestors would have thrived on, that's what we need to do too, and not get fixated on just magnesium or just potassium or just sodium or just protein or just, vegetables. There's an abundance of all of these that our bodies have evolved to thrive with.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems that, a lot of what you focus on is talking about the health of salt, but that's also generalizing, right? Not all salts are created equally. So can you talk a little bit about why real salt is so much better for people?
Yeah, that's a great question. When you look at salt, when we talk about salt in food, we're talking about sodium and chloride, sodium chloride. There's a lot of other salts in chemistry. Magnesium sulfate would be an example of a salt where you have an acid and a base that are bound together. So when I say salt today, I'm talking about table salt or sodium chloride based salt. And all salt comes from a seabed at some point. It might be a current ocean, San Francisco Bay, Gulf of Mexico, Sea of Japan. It might be a dead sea, like the Dead Sea in Israel, or the Great Salt Lake here in Utah. Or it could be an ancient seabed, a seabed that was laid down during the Jurassic era, like the salt deposit here in Utah, this crystalline rose quartzy colored salt, or the Himalayan salt that comes out of Nepal and Pakistan, or the Bolivian pink salt that comes out of South America. But they're all seabeds at some point. If we go to a seabed or even the current ocean today, it's not water and pure sodium and chloride. It's a complex chloride. In our oceans, we have iodine, which is why seaweed and kelp and fish have higher levels of iodine. There's also potassium chloride, calcium chloride, magnesium chloride. All of these nutrients are in the seawater, just like they are in our bodies. And historically, our human ancestors would have gathered salt in one of two ways. The first way, they would have, like my grandfather, watched the animals, and the animals will find these ancient seabeds, and they will eat that salt in its crystal form from this ancient seabed. That's how the Himalayan deposit was discovered. That's how the salt here in Utah was discovered, as well as the Bolivian salt. By watching the animals, our early ancestors found those deposits. The other way would be to go to a current ocean. Ocean water today is about 3% salt. Our bodies are 0.9. So the reason that the ocean water stings our eyes and burns our nose is because it's 2 to 3 times more salty than we are. If the ocean was exact saline like we are, 0.9%, you could flush it in your eyes, you could run it through your nose, and there would be no sensation, which is why an IV doesn't burn, because it matches that 0.9% so well. But that's also why the ocean stings our eyes. Well, water can hold 26% sodium and chloride by weight. At 26%, that water is what we call max salinity. And so it can't hold any more salt. So if I put this salt crystal in a bucket, it would dissolve this salt crystal until the water hit 26%. Then the crystal would never dissolve any further because it's at max salinity. So our ancestors would have gone to the ocean, filled a bucket full of water, brought it back, put it over the fire, burned or evaporated all the water off. And eventually that water goes from 3% to 4%, 26%. At 26%, the water can't hold any more salt. So it falls out of suspension, and eventually you're left with a pan of salt. And so when that happens, that pan of salt has all of the trace minerals trapped within the salt crystals that were in the ocean. So it's got sodium chloride, also has magnesium chloride, some potassium chloride in trace amounts, primarily sodium chloride. And then the other way to do that would be to take that water, bring it into a settling pond. So we're there at the coast, we dig a channel and channel all the ocean water in on high tide. Then we cut it off, and we're going to line that pond with gray clay. Because if we just have sand, the water's going to just disappear again. Now, clay creates a barrier. It doesn't let the salt water out. So we bring all the salt water into a clay-lined pond, and now the sun will start to evaporate that water just like we would if it was in our kitchen. And eventually, all that salt will dissolve or settle off as the water evaporates. And then we'll go back with the rake, and we're going to rake up that salt on the bottom of that pond along with some of that gray clay. So the French gray salt comes because there's that clay-lined pond that salt has now mixed with, and that's where we get French gray salt. And if we did the same process in Hawaii with Hawaiian red clay, we'd end up with Hawaiian red salt. And in either of those cases, you have this complete whole version of salt, which was the same process that took place 150 million years ago in the seabed. That's now the remnants of the Redmond real salt, the Himalayan pink salt, the Bolivian pink salt, because it's processed all together. So that's how our ancestors would have always gathered salt. Now we fast forward, and most salts today, or many salts today, if they come from the ocean around the turn of the century, salt companies realized that they could change the process a little bit in two ways. The first way is that seawater has calcium chloride, magnesium chloride, potassium chloride. Those are valuable. So instead of bringing the salt into one pond and letting that complete process take place all at once, we can move that salt through a series of evaporation ponds and pull off the potassium chloride. Then we can pull off the magnesium chloride. Then we can pull off the calcium chloride. And we can take those and sell them to different industries. And now the nature of salt isn't quite the same, because if we had an orange and we pulled out the vitamin C and then sold the orange, it might make economic sense, but it doesn't really make nutritional sense. I would suggest no. And so that's one of the ways salt changed. The other problem, and I would even say the bigger problem, because the trace minerals that are getting leached off, not a big amount. It's not a dietary source of potassium, not a dietary source of magnesium. I mean, it's important, and trace amounts are great. The bigger challenge with salt, though, is salt in nature is hygroscopic. You alluded to this earlier because you said salt's job in the body is to help regulate the intercellular and extracellular fluids. And it does that through the sodium-potassium pump, where the body will use potassium and sodium to help pull in through that sodium-potassium pump and flush the cells of fluid, which cleans the cells, hydrates the cells, and essentially keeps us alive. And salt, because of that, if we have this salt crystal sitting on a counter in Florida on a really humid day, the crystal will actually suck water out of the air as a dehumidifier. That's what hygroscopic means. So the challenge, though, is if I have salt crystals now, and they're in a shaker or a pouch, and on a humid day, the salt is sucking water out of the air, the salt's going to get clumpy. It's going to get kind of sticky. So some people will put rice in their shaker to help combat that. Well, about that same 100 years ago or so, probably less, some salt companies sat down and said, we want to find a chemical that we can coat this crystal with that would stop this crystal's ability to interact with moisture. Because if we can do that, then when it's raining outside, the salt will still pour out of the shaker. And so they came up with a list of chemicals. You know where I'm going with this.
Yep.
So they came up with a list of chemicals that they could put into the salt. So when it would rain outside, the salt would pour out of the shaker. And the tagline, great marketing campaign, was born. The tagline is, when it rains, it pours. There's a little cute girl with an umbrella, and the rain's coming down, and she's got the salt shaker, and the salt's just trickling out behind her as she's walking down the humid road. Beautiful campaign, but that's why so many salts today have an ingredient list. If your salt has an ingredient list, you know it's not natural, clean salt, because that salt has been created or manufactured to stop its ability to interact with moisture, which is salt's entire job in the body, is to create electricity because it's an electrolyte. Our mind tells our hands to move with an electric current. That's the main job. And the secondary job is to hydrate and regulate fluids. And so if you take a salt that's been the source of life, a source of trade, essential, written in every religious text and every history book, and then you demineralize it, and then you process it and coat it with chemicals, that's why salt is no longer salt. And so years ago, the family sat around and said, what do we call this stuff? It's not processed salt. It's not additive salt. It's just real salt. And that's, kind of silly at the time, but that's kind of where the name real salt came from.
I mean, it makes sense. It's both ownable, but also explanatory, right? This actually kind of reminds me of a topic we're both passionate about, which is organic. And I feel like part of the reason organic is behind the curve against mainstream chemical agriculture, as I'll call it, is because at a certain point, chemical agriculture got called conventional or normal agriculture, right? So the power of those words meant that when people in the started trying to make organic the norm again, it was labeled as something different. There was agriculture, and then there was organic, right? Which made it seem strange and weird, and like you're doing some weird witchcraft with it, making it strange. Like when I was introducing organic in the early days to some of my friends, they were like, "Oh, that's weird hippie stuff. That's gross. Get it away from me." But it's exactly the opposite. It's like the other way around, like you're saying. So I love that you labeled it real salt, because that's kind of illustrating the difference. Whereas I feel like if organic could have been labeled as real food, and then conventional was actually labeled as chemical food, then it would paint the picture much better for the most of the world. So you're kind of doing that with your brand name and saying, like, there's processed salt and then there's real salt.
And it's unfortunate. I love that idea. If you could go back in time and we just call food, and then we call the other stuff processed, chemical version of food. Something unique about salt, because you mentioned organic, salt's unique because salt, by the definition of organic, as you know, is once living or carbon-based, are the two typical definitions that you have for the term organic. Salt was never living. It wasn't alive like a plant is or an animal is, and it's not carbon-based, which again, plant and animals in life or previous life are. So in the U.S., salt itself cannot, by definition, be defined as organic because it doesn't meet the classification as being alive, once living, or carbon-based. So if you look at our salt, you won't see organic because it, by definition, can't be. So that's a little bit confusing as you're looking. There's three questions I think everybody should ask when they're trying to find a good, clean salt. And I think the same questions apply if you're looking for great pickles, great kimchi, great eggs, avocados, whatever it is. And you might end up with Redmond Real Salt, and I'm biased, and I think it's a pretty good brand. But there's some other good brands out there that I think are equally great. And I think if you ask yourself these three questions, you can find great products, both for consumption as well as, the clothes we wear and the bikes we ride.
I'm excited for the questions. What are the questions?
Leave you in suspense. So the first one is, who's producing it? In
Mm.
food, that's increasingly difficult. And especially with salt, that's even harder. Because if you walk into a grocery store and you see just some canister that says salt on it, knowing what seabed, either current ocean or ancient seabed that came from, on almost every brand, especially your big brands, is near impossible to be able to
Yeah,
walk
they
in and
probably
pick.
don't even know.
Exactly. And even if you walk into a big box store and you buy a pink salt or a black salt or a gray salt, oftentimes that salt has been shipped and commingled. And again, knowing exactly where that came from becomes difficult. So, one of the nice things about a farmer's market, if actually farmers are at the market and people aren't just selling stuff from the grocery store, which does happen, at least around here,
Yeah.
um, is you can look at the person in the eye and say, hey, the person that's made the kimchi or the sauerkraut or the pickles or the grew the cucumbers or is bringing the eggs, know actually who is producing it, I think is the first step. Because if you know who's producing it, then you can ask the second question, which is, what's the source? Where's it coming from? In salt, that's really important because unfortunately, we humans haven't been the best stewards of the planet that we live on. And water being the universal solvent becomes a bit of a challenge if you're gathering your salt from the San Francisco Bay or maybe the Gulf of Mexico during BP or the Sea of Alaska during Exxon Valdez or, Sea of Japan during the Japanese nuclear meltdown. And so I think it's really important knowing where that source is because if you can know who's producing it and then you know the source, then the next question, which I think is really the important one, comes into play. And that's, what's the process? What are they doing to the item? Are they taking anything out? Are they putting anything in? And I think if you can determine that, whether it's raw milk that you like, or you're buying meat, or you're buying eggs, or you're buying fish, or even a shirt, if you can know who's producing it, know where it's coming from, and know what they're doing to it, I think as consumers, we're going to buy better products because we vote for the world we want to live in with our dollars. And I think, I'm not as always intentional as I would like to be, but when I am intentional, and if I want to have a sweet treat and get a cookie, I like my cookies, and there's certain brands that I know they are asking those questions, and I can feel maybe a little less guilty. Or if I'm going to get a bag of potato chips, yeah, there's going to be some fats there, but if I know one of my favorite chip brands is Boulder, and I think they source good products. They use avocado oil. They use a nice salt. Yeah, chips aren't maybe the healthiest thing for me, but if I can find brands that I know who's producing it, I know where they're coming from, I know what they're doing or not doing, um, I think you'll find a better salt, and I think we'll probably live in a better world.
Yeah, I love that formula for lots of things, like you said, salt, but other kind of food or even clothing or anything else like that. And I feel like part of the reason number 3 is important is because somewhere along the way we've been lied to or misled over and over that, oh, we're taking this out because it's bad for you, or oh, we're putting this in because it's good for you. And that was all based off of, like you illustrated earlier in the conversation, one study that maybe wasn't peer reviewed or whatever, and really the motivation behind it is so that it pours even when it's raining, or that they can grow more crops with pesticides on it and it doesn't kill the crops, or whatever. But there's all these additives that were put in, and the big food tells us, well, we're doing this for you to make it better for you, but in reality they're doing it for them to sell more product, to get a higher price point, or to reduce costs or whatever else.
And
So
we
the reason I like that number 3 is because I think we all need to pay more attention to how modified our food is, right? The closer we can get to whole foods that haven't been processed at all, the better, because all the other stuff is pure speculation right now. I don't care if the latest science in the world has verified that this one ingredient's good for you or bad for you. I can almost guarantee 10 years from now that science will have changed, because our bodies and our ecosystems are so complex. There's almost no way to to generalize anything with that amount of certainty, I guess I would say.
And with that complexity, one of the things, and you and I kind of mentioned these earlier, is we believe that for the most part, nature has it right with products. And so if we can get back to nature and look at the diets that our ancestors were eating, and try to get back to that simple, clean, and real approach that's sustained, humans and animals since the dawn of time, I think it'd be hard to really improve on an orange. And yeah, maybe you can, use some complex chemistry, and maybe they'll get close and eventually be able to make an egg, or maybe they could make a fig even better than nature can make it. But I tend to believe and want to live in a world where I think that nature has it right. And so as much as possible, going back to nature versus to the chemistry lab. And I have nothing against medicine. I have nothing against chemistry. And if we can use some of these technologies to save lives and to make food more available in areas that it's not, I'm not against that at all. But when I have the option, I think going back to nature, I do. For me, that feels better.
Totally. And to present a more balanced perspective than maybe I did a second ago, in areas where we've depleted nutrients from the soil or from the water or from the whatever, and doing what we can to put that back in is helpful for sure. So I think there's some level of additive that is beneficial. But to your point, if we hadn't messed with nature to begin with, all that stuff was probably already there, right? And I like your example of the orange because it's a good way to paint that story of what you take out or put in. So an orange itself was, like you said, more or less perfect. Like you can peel the rind or even use some of the rind, but like when you eat the orange, you're eating all the pulp and everything else with it. Plus you get the nutrients from the juice, etc. But then if you just go juice that orange and remove the pulp, it's like already a little less good for you, right? Because now all of a sudden you're consuming all the sugars without the fibers. So it's just all those steps of processing that the more you get away from that whole food, the more you're opening up issues by extracting things that nature intended to go together. Nature didn't intend us to not eat the pulp. Nature intended intended to deliver us a more balanced nutrient, not just an extract of one of the ingredients within that plant or whatever. But I think that ties back into what you were talking about with real salt. Is part of the benefit is that you haven't extracted all the things to sell each part of the salt as individual ingredients to companies. You keep the salt more or less as is, pretty much unprocessed, right? Can you talk a little bit about your process?
Yeah, our process is super basic. Actually, you could do the entire thing with a hammer out of your toolbox and the screen out of your kitchen window. The salt crystals are in this ancient seabed. The deposit's 1/4 mile wide, 3 miles long, 5,000 feet deep, just solid salt. So we will chew the salt off the wall with a carbide tipped. It's a rotary drum that chews the salt off. It comes off in chunks just like this, and then we just crush it and screen it to the right size. We have 4 basic granulations. There's a coarse size that I keep some at my kitchen table, and I'll just suck on it sometimes. Sometimes you just have a craving. You think it might be sugar, but oftentimes you're actually craving salt. So I'll just pick at it throughout the day, and if salt tastes really sweet, it's probably because I'm a little low on salt, and it starts getting more salty the more you consume. We have a size that's called kosher size. In salt, the term kosher has 2 meanings. So if you ever buy, or if you're watching a cooking show and they talk about grabbing your kosher salt, that is 2 meanings. In Judaism, in the Torah, blood is seen as unclean. So if you and I were Jewish, we can't eat blood. Meaning, if we want a piece of steak, we can't eat that steak. I'm using my cell phone as a steak illustration. But if we were eating this piece of steak, we'd have to get the blood out of that steak before we could eat it. Salt, being hygroscopic, absorbs moisture, so it absorbs blood. And a larger salt crystal will suck blood out of that steak better than a finer salt crystal, without making the meat overly salty, because we can then brush off the salt. And so to kosher a piece of meat, we use kosher sized salt that sucks the blood out of that meat. So the size of salt crystal that's like you might see on a margarita rimmer, or you might see on a pretzel, that is, or on edamame at a Japanese restaurant, that size of crystal is known as koshering salt or kosher sized salt. And that is a particular size. Now, all of our salt can be certified as clean or as approved for the Jewish community. So a lot of products, you'll have like a U with a circle around it, or a K with a star on it. Those are all organizations within the Jewish community that will certify, kind of like a health inspector. They don't offer a sacrament or anything. They just come to the facility and make sure you're washing your hands and there's no items that would be seen as unclean for the Jewish community. So in salt, you have we call it kosher squared, because you have kosher sized salt that can be kosher certified, or you can have kosher sized salt that is not kosher certified, or you can have fine salt that's kosher certified, but it's not kosher sized. So I know that's kind of confusing, but I told you I'd geek out on salt.
Yeah, I'm starting to feel like you deserve like an honorary doctorate in salt or something like that with all the knowledge you're dropping. I'm not sure if I assume all this research that you have is from a bazillion sources, but if there's not one book you can point people to about the history of salt and the benefits of salt, that might be a book you have to write.
If anybody's interested or wants to verify some of the history of salt stories, as far as the term "is a man worth his salt," and just a fascinating book, it's called "Salt: A World History." Fascinating book, and
we'll put a link to it in the notes.
Yeah, sorry, it's if you like salt, it's and even if you don't, you might find it an interesting read. Another one is called "Salt Your Way to Health." It was written by an MD in the Midwest. His name's Dr. David Brownstein, and his book is called "Salt Your Way to Health." And another really fun book on salt. And then more recently, there was a book written by Dr. James D. Nicolantonio, and he is a doctor from the East Coast. Excellent book on salt and the importance of salt. And then he has a second book on just health and fitness in general. So a couple of resources.
Well, we love sharing book recommendations in the show notes. So if you're listening to this and you didn't catch all that or write it down, just take a look in the notes. With that said, I know Redmond Real Salt started as salt, but now you have other salt-based products. One of my favorites is the Relight hydration kind of electrolyte mix. But you've got other things like clay-based toothpaste and so on and so forth, based on what I saw at the trade show. So can you talk to me a little bit about what your innovation process looks like? Like, when did you start launching other products, and how do you decide which products to launch?
Yeah, so a lot of that comes from customer feedback. The nice thing about salt, it's used in about everything. And so we can take salt, add it with organic freeze-dried garlic, and we end up with amazing garlic salt. A lot of seasoning companies today will use flavor enhancers to enhance and to mask some of the bitterness of salt. Natural salt actually has a sweet taste to it if you taste it side by side. When you add all these other chemicals, it makes salt more bitter or more salty. And so a lot of seasoning companies will add sugars, or they will add flavor enhancers, where with natural, good, clean, organic, freeze-dried spices and good, clean salt, we don't have to do that. So a natural extension at first was just, hey, we're using seasoning salt at our house, and we looked at the label of the seasoning salt, and we didn't like all the crap that was in it. And so we thought, hey, it's not that hard to get organic, coriander and paprika and celery and make our own, all season or seasonal or seasoning salt. And a lot of people like smoked flavors, smoked meats. And so salt being hygroscopic you can actually smoke salt just like you would smoke a prime rib. And so we have smoked salt that you can add to veggies. You can add as a cocktail rimmer. You can add on white chocolate, and it gives you a sweet and savory salt to go with your food. So those are kind of the easy, natural line extensions. Years ago, Gatorade all these sports drinks got really popular. And some people don't know that Gatorade was created to aid the Florida Gators, the football team. They're sweating, they're hot, they're cramping up, they're nauseous because of the loss of electrolytes. And so they said, hey, we need to replace these electrolytes, which they needed to do. But instead of starting with something clean, they added, pink and purple and blue food coloring and all kinds of sugars and preservatives, where you could take a quart of good, clean water, add a quarter teaspoon of good, clean salt, a squeeze of lemon and some honey or some fig syrup, and you would have an amazing sports drink. But it's not always convenient. And so we thought, hey, let's take our salt. Most people need to find additional sources of potassium and magnesium because they're not eating enough leafy greens and foods rich in potassium. So we took the salt, added some potassium, some magnesium, added a little bit of stevia, and made a powder version of a sports drink that you can put in a bottle of water if you're heading out for a run, or if you're doing hot yoga, or even just to replace some of the electrolytes, because our tears, our sweat, our urine, everything is salt. And if we don't replace those, bad things start to happen. So that was another kind of a fun line extension. The cosmetics, the toothpaste, and some of the facial products, this deposit there on my grandfather's farm, just that's right next to that deposit, is an outcropping of this bentonite volcanic ash based clay that's great for facials. People use it for poultices. And it's also a great base for toothpaste. It's very alkaline, nice polisher. So it sounds crazy, salt and mud toothpaste. But it's made with essential oils and salt and clay. And it's growing up, I said maybe my dad was a genius or maybe he was cheap, but he had us brush our teeth with a powder that he would make with salt and clay. And some of your grandmothers, a lot of our grandparents would use baking soda and salt to brush their teeth with. So it's not that uncommon, but growing up, I was a little bit embarrassed and didn't think it tasted very good either, using my dad's, salt and clay powder, but, great teeth, never had, cavity problems, but I thought my kids, they're not going to be too keen on just the powder version. So I mixed it up and added some essential oil, and we have some with and without xylitol, which is somewhat controversial. Some like it, some don't, but it has been shown by the hygienist to not promote tooth decay. So we have some with xylitol in it. But so a lot of the stuff is just somebody saying, "Man, I really like this, but I wonder if it could be a little better." So
that's cool. That's fun. And then as a team, you just come up with a formula or process or whatever that feels like it fits the brand of kind of using more natural, pure, clean, nutrient-dense ingredients and go from there.
Yep, that's right. And then what we also do, we'll start with what we think is a pretty good start, and then we'll send it out to some of our key customers, as well as some folks like Dr. James, Tina Antonio, who are very passionate about salt and nutrition, and who know more as a community, know more than we do individually. And so we kind of just keep refining and honing those in with our partners and network.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's fun seeing all the different new products coming out. And that also made me wonder, and you kind of alluded to the answer to this earlier with 900 years of mining left in your salt mine. But I started thinking, well, this is a finite resource of a deposit that's there, whereas, seawater can constantly create new salt theoretically. But you're working with this pure salt that's been kind of trapped under the earth for a little while. So it's finite source. So I was going to ask, well, how much longer can you do that? How big is this deposit? Like, if you keep making more and more products and this company is more and more successful, what's going to happen when you run out of salt and what your plan is? But I guess 900 years is a long time, but let's project to your great, 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 to the power of 20 or something like that, grandchildren. What what's the idea when the salt mine runs out? Like, there's no way of replenishing it, right? Is there maybe you just dip into other things like the clay or other things on the land?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to your point, it is a finite resource in the grand scheme of things. Fortunately, there's a lot of great salt sources around the world, and the beauty of a salt mine is there's a lot of uses for it, even if you stopped mining completely. In Europe in World War II, a lot of people went into the salt mines to live in the salt mines to get away from the war-torn Europe. They took priceless pieces of arts down into these salt mines and actually built cathedrals. So you can go over to Salzburg, Germany, and go underground and see these beautiful carved cathedrals underground in the salt. And so we don't have that many miles and that many caverns in our deposit yet, but I would like to think in some, future state, if the salt starts to become a point when they're kind of, 900 years from now, that that deposit would turn into some beautiful works of art underground, like some of these massive salt mines are in Europe.
That's cool. I could totally picture a Redmond Real Salt Hotel or something like an underground salt hotel. I've seen some that are like built out of ice in kind of northern areas, but that would be cool to have a salt hotel. But I guess one story that I don't know how all the details, but I remember at the university that I went to, Colorado State, I remember at some point in some class hearing one of the teachers or faculty talk about how there were these beams used for one of the buildings on campus. There were these big chunky wood beams, and at the time that building was built, the architects or the builders or whoever had the foresight to say, you know what, at some point, if one of these beams gives out, it's going to be really hard to replace it because it's harder and harder to find a chunk of wood this thick. So what they did was planted some trees on campus that within 100 years or however long that building had been around would be big enough to be able to harvest and replace that beam if needed. So it's kind of brilliant. So that makes me wonder, you still have quite a long time to go, 900 years, but would there be a way to kind of on part of the property be like replenishing it? And I know that part of the benefit is that millions of years ago when this was deposited, there were a lot less toxins in the air and pollution and so on and so forth. So you could probably never make it quite that clean. But I almost wonder if, 900 years from now, I'm sure, I'm hoping not, but I'm assuming that the air will be even more polluted. So maybe if you started like replenishing the mine now to be harvested in 900 years, you'd still have an amazing asset of still the cleanest salt left on the planet.
Yeah, that is an interesting. I love that idea of the foresight of those early builders to replant a tree to replace the beam 100 years from the time the beam was. Love that idea with salt and the way this salt was formed over millennia. I don't know. It's a really interesting thought exercise. I don't know that it's possible, but I
Yeah.
think it's still a worthy exercise.
Yeah, it could be fun to just think about how that would even be possible because I mean, we'll always theoretically have the oceans, but you never know what's going to happen with the planet. So it'd be fun to just as a fun thought exercise to figure out how you replenish something like that. So as I was digging a little bit deeper into your brand on your website, I noticed that there is a whole like a bunch of messages around this idea of living intentionally and with purpose. Can you explain how you all came up with that philosophy and how it resonates or why it resonates so much with your team?
Yeah, when my grandpa and his brother started the company, they created the company based on this idea of treating people the way they would like to be treated, and that's what they kind of founded the company on. And I've heard it called the platinum rule. Don't treat me like you want to be treated. Treat me like I want to be treated. And
Yeah.
and uh, and then came to realize that you spend more time with the people you work with than often you do with your own family. I've got three boys. They're in high school, and I see them for a little bit in the morning. I see them a little bit before bed, but I really see those that I work with and spend time with at work. And so we wanted to have a company be a place that could be more than just a place of work. It could actually be your mission in life, and it could
Mm.
be a way that you could feel engaged and fulfilled. And so this idea of elevating the human experience is what we try to keep focused on at all times here at Redmond. And to do that, we love this idea of putting ourselves in the place of most potential. And rather than saying we're a family focused company or we're a community focused company, we want to be a principle focused company, and not and just be flexible enough to be able to live intentionally. And so that's kind of where that philosophy comes from. And knowing that sometimes, for me, my place of most potential is probably going to be, hopefully, right now, it's doing a podcast with you.
Yeah.
But then maybe another day, it is spending time with my son. Another day, it might be going to a trade show. And so I think as we create a company where you can really be in your place of most potential. And that isn't necessarily with your community. It might not be with your family. It might not be at work. But I love that idea, and we try to talk about that a lot here and help our teams really try to live that way, rather than having really structured policies about time off and time here, and just trying to create an environment. And it doesn't always work, and we fall short as a company, but that's our ideal, is trying to create a company where we elevate the human experience both through activities, through the culture we create here at the company, and through the products that we help bring to market.
I love that. And as you just said, like elevate the human experience, that makes me wonder, like, are there group activities you do as a company to intentionally, or I don't want to say forcefully, but we all get caught up in working and stuck on deadlines and so on and so forth. So sometimes you do have to force your team to step away from the computer and do something that's not work based that will elevate their human experience. So and I know that you have done a lot of work with like Boy Scouts and Trails Foundation. So does some of that kind of weave into your work culture where you do, shut the computers off and go out and do something to elevate your experience as a team?
Yeah, so all of the teams have a budget to do monthly activities. Well, we also have libraries. You can see some books here, behind me in the office, and we'll have teams do book reviews and book clubs. And the team activities we find are really helpful. Maybe team members and their spouses or their plus ones maybe go to a play and a show so they can interact with those outside of work. What we really find though is those cross-functional teams, kind of like your podcast here, connecting two people that normally don't work together, new information is created. And so
Yeah.
we have other budgets that we set aside for more cross-functional, where we'll take a group and we might go ice fishing for the day, or we might take a group and do a humanitarian project either in the US or overseas, where we get people from the different divisions of the company spending time together focused on something besides themselves. And we find when we do that, it produces better team results, because we get people that maybe work on the mining team with those that are in marketing, with those that are in production, and new information is generated. And then on the
Nice.
individual side, we try to be a good member of our community. So personally, I love mountain biking. And so the company gives paid days, 3 paid days a year, to go volunteer at any organization that you would like to. So some people do that at Boys and Girls Club. Some people might do that with the Boy Scouts of America, or the local, recycle center. I like to take my time and go work on our trails. There's a local trails foundation here, and I love to spend time, building and maintaining trails for the mountain biking and running communities. And so that's another way that we try to elevate and allow people to contribute in the way that's most meaningful for them. And so instead of saying, hey, we're only going to focus on this particular charity, we open that up and say, hey, we want you to contribute in the best way that you know how, whether that's doing a free musical concert or volunteering at the Boys and Girls Club, or for me, I find I'm a better husband and father and team member if I get out on the trails occasionally. And so that's where I choose to donate the time that the company gives me to donate to the community. I do that at the Trails Foundation.
That's beautiful. And it sounds like a lot of overlap with some of our policies at Modern Species too, the paid time off, or the focus on personal well-being, personal growth, and doing retreats together, whatever else we can do to support each other and learn from each other, and recognize that work is just a part of your life, right? And if we can't be whole as individuals, then we can't bring our whole self to the team, and we can't bring the whole team to the company and support our mission together. So I love all those things that you're doing. And since it is B Corp month, I'd be remiss to ask if you've considered going through the B Corp certification process, because it sounds like you're already checking off most of the assessment with what you're doing with supply chain and taking care of your communities and your people, and so on and so forth. So is that something that's on your to-do list?
We have looked at it. It's quite a process to go through all of that, and so we haven't jumped through those hoops yet. But I think the intent, I think we hit a lot of that, but haven't gone through the process yet. So maybe one day.
Yeah, that was on my to-do list for a long time, and I think it probably took me from knowing about B Corp and wanting to do it, I think it was like 6 years or something until I intentionally started diving in, because it is intimidating. But then also, as I went through the process for the first time, it probably still took like a year and a half to get done, partly because of starting and stopping, because it's a good chunk of work, that takes time to measure and pull reports and figure out how you would answer things. Or if you see some low-hanging fruit, just go ahead and do those things so that you can come back and report them. So it is quite the process, so I'll definitely give you that. But I've found it to be valuable in that, especially when you're already doing a lot, it's nice to have proof, like a third-party verified source saying, yes, you are doing that. But it's also great to just see the areas that you're lacking that you may not have even thought of that could be good for your team or your community or whatever, and set those goals to improve. And then again, having that accountability to kind of make those steps towards improving. I think that's part of why I got pushed to do it, because it just felt like a great growth opportunity for the company. Like growth, as I mean, like developing the company's culture and mission further.
And one of the things I love, you mentioned earlier about, maybe the water in 900 years is not going to look as great. Things like B Corp and, looking at the millennials and the Gen X, the younger generation coming up that seem to be a lot more aware, and they care. I think a lot of, my kids, their friends and the consumers, they want to buy from companies who they feel good about, and they want to make a difference and a lasting impression on the society. And so I'm hopeful, even though there's some things trending that you think, this isn't great, but there are bits of greatness like B Corp and like the passion of the younger generation, that I'm hopeful that we'll learn from our mistakes. We'll take pride in what we've been able to do, and then we'll keep marching that forward. And friends like Dennis Weaver, that are just so passionate about organic and health and life and lifestyle. And I think there's so much great in the world today, and I think there's so much better than sometimes we think if we watch the 10 o'clock news. So I'm actually really excited about the future. And I think the younger generation, yes, they might be on their phones too often. And yes, we probably have too many social media releases. But I do think we've got great generations coming up and great companies and great products to look forward to.
Yeah, well, speaking of the future, I think this is a great way to wrap up, because I know I've probably kept you too long at this point. But I know you have kids, so this is probably on your mind a lot. But even just as somebody who helps control what the future of the planet looks like through even just this small way of kind of controlling the salt mine for the next 900 years or something. There's a lot that's going on in the world right now. A lot of talk about what kind of world we're leaving for the future. So I thought this would be a fun question to ask you, which is, if you could just have one wish granted for the future, what would it be?
That people live intentionally. I think as people live intentionally, they'll be happier, they'll be healthier. And I think as that happens, life itself gets better. I know that's the case for me. If I'm intentional and I get out and I spend time in the mountains with my mountain bike, and if I eat better, I'm happier and healthier, and I'm less short with my kids. I'm more pleasant to be around at work. And I think if everybody could just be a little more intentional in the future, the world would be a lot better place.
Beautiful. And I love how that perfectly ties into the brand as well. But you can tell that resonates with you as an individual human as well. So I love that. I'm a big fan of being intentional, whether it's with what kind of work you choose to do or who you choose to do that work with, or how you spend your free time, or how you're connecting in with future generations, or whatever else. I think as long as you're being intentional, you're probably going to make better decisions and be a more whole person to bring to the world. So I love that. Sweet. Well, thanks for taking a little chunk out of your time to share a little bit more about Redmond Real Salt and your kind of personal passions and journey. It's always fun to hear, to get to know people a little bit more that I've known online or through email. And it was really fun to hear more about you, what you're up to, and what the company is aiming to do and create in the world. So thanks for doing what you do, and thanks for kind of being an example of doing things better in the world through both business and your personal life.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's been a real pleasure. Hopefully one of these days we'll get you out here and give you a tour of the salt mine, and maybe we'll go hit the bike trails.
Yeah, that sounds amazing. I might have to just make that happen. You know, sometimes things happen for you, but sometimes you can make them happen. So that sounds like a lot of fun. So I'll follow up on that at some point. But again, thanks for your generosity and coming out and sharing the story. Cheers.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about Redmond, visit redmond.life. That's REDMOND.life.
Subscribe to our podcast and YouTube channel for more innovator interviews, expert advice, and leadership discussions. If you like this episode, leave a heart, thumbs up, or review, and share it with your colleagues. As an ever-evolving show, we also love feedback, so send us your thoughts or ideas for who we should talk to next to evolve@modernspecies.com.